So here we are with the last video for chapter 19 on the respiratory system, and we'll be looking at gas exchange and how external and internal respiration occur. So here we go. So the alveolus. Remember that the wall of the alveolus is a simple squamous epithelium. So if we imagine the alveolus here, and it's lined with a single layer of squamous cells. There's the nucleus in each one, and you get the point. And flowing past is the blood, and the blood vessels are also built of simple squamous epithelium. It's the endothelium layer of the blood vessels. Okay, so hopefully you get the point. So now we have air in here and blood in here. And here's one of the little blood cells that are whizzing past. So the respiratory membrane then is this layer of simple squamous epithelium, that is the alveolar layer, and this layer of endothelium of the blood vessel, and then the in-between layer of the basement membrane, where we have a bunch of protein fibers that are supporting, holding together the cells of the endothelium and of the alveolus. And so it's across this membrane, then, that oxygen and carbon dioxide must diffuse in order for respiration to occur. So remember, O2 is lipid soluble, so that means it will diffuse from where it's at high concentration to where it is at low concentration. And so it'll move into the cytoplasm of the alveolar cells, across the basement membrane into the cytoplasm of the endothelium cells, and then on into the fluids, the plasma of the blood. And all that's happening through the passive process of diffusion, where we're moving from a region of high concentration to a region of low concentration. Okay, so that's your reminder to kind of get you set up. So what is it that affects or that controls the amount of diffusion that can happen across this membrane? Well, one thing is that surface area is important. The more surface area, then the more diffusion that we can have occurring. And the surface area of the lungs, the interior of the lungs, is very large. That alveolar surface is very large. So we get rapid or a lot of diffusion happening. The second thing that affects diffusion is the distance that the gases have to diffuse. The shorter the distance, then the more rapid the diffusion occurs. And so that's the point of having two simple squamous epithelia there, is that we get the very shortest distance possible for diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide to be happening. Third factor affecting diffusion is how soluble the gas is. The greater it's the solubility of the gas in lipids, then the faster diffusion occurs. And the gases will diffuse very easily, or dissolve very easily into lipids, and so it can move across the membrane very quickly and easily. Sorry, I'm rummaging in my bag while I'm doing this. Okay, so that noise is going to go away. I apologize. And then last of all, what can influence the speed with which diffusion occurs is how different the concentrations of the gases are on either side of the membrane that they're diffusing across. The greater the difference, then the more rapidly the diffusion will occur. So that's what I mean by the steepness of the gradient. If it's super high inside the alveolus and super low in the lungs, then it's going to go very much faster than if we have sort of a moderately high concentration in the air in the lungs and a moderately low concentration in the blood. So gas exchange at this respiratory surface there in the lungs is happens very quickly because the diffusion distance is short, and both of the gases that are moving dissolve very easily in lipids and can move quickly across the basement membrane and from one side of that membrane to the other. So, external respiration is what we want to think about first. And so if we're looking, I'm looking for the page here. Yeah, so we've been working, by the way, on pages 754, 755. With external respiration, air in the lungs has a relatively high oxygen concentration and relatively low CO2 concentration. So if this is the alveolus, and here's the blood vessel, and I'm not going to draw the cells now because, or the endothelium cells and the cells of the alveolar wall, but when we breathe in air, we bring in relatively high concentrations of O2, and the air that we're breathing in has relatively low CO2 concentrations. That makes sense. The air that we're breathing in has not been depleted of oxygen, and it's not been enriched with carbon dioxide yet. The blood that's coming from the heart to the lungs, though, is going to be high CO2 and low oxygen. Hopefully that makes sense, because the blood that's coming to the lungs is coming from it's coming from the right side of the heart, which is bringing blood from the peripheral tissues to the heart and then on to the lungs. And so this is blood that's already been out in the body, had a chance to have the oxygen removed from it, or a lot of the oxygen removed from it, so that we could make ATP out there in the peripheral tissues. And in the process of making ATP, then lots of CO2 has made its way into the blood. And so as this low oxygen, high CO2 blood passes by the alveolus, then the CO2 will diffuse from high to low into the air in the lungs, while the oxygen will diffuse from high to low into the blood, into the plasma of the blood. And this happens relatively quickly, so that by the time this blood is finished with the alveolus, the air in the alveolus and the concentration the concentration of oxygen in the alveolus and in the blood has become very, very similar. So it moves, there's diffusion that occurs really rapidly. All right, so far so good. So what about internal respiration? So now we have the blood moving along out in a capillary network. Here's a cell. Here are the mitochondria where ATP is being made. Here's another cell over here. Here's its nucleus. Here's some mitochondria. So we're making CO2 here in the cell. So this is where it's going to be high CO2. The interstitial fluid will be medium or moderate amounts of CO2. Where is it going to be highest? Well, hopefully it's going to be, where is it going to be lowest? Hopefully it's going to be lowest in the blood that's passing through. And so as the capillary network makes its way through the peripheral tissue fluids, then CO2 is going to be moved from the tissue fluids into the blood because it's very low CO2 here. So as the blood goes past the alveolus, or I'm sorry, past the tissue fluids in the capillary network, CO2 is going to be moving from the cells to the tissue fluids and into the blood. The blood that's coming from the heart, from the left side of the heart, is going to be really enriched in oxygen, while the cells out here are going to be very low oxygen. And again, the interstitial fluid will be moderate or medium oxygen. So this time, diffusion carries the oxygen from the blood into the peripheral fluids, and then from the peripheral tissue fluids into the tissue cells. So again, using only the process of diffusion, oxygen and CO2 find their way to the region of lowest concentration. For CO2, that's the blood that's rushing past. And for oxygen, those would be the cells there in the tissues. So that's internal respiration. So when we think about oxygen transport, at external respiration, we're loading O2 into the blood, I should say, at the alveoli. And so, again, alveolus, there's the capillary network. I'm going to draw it really big here because there's lots of stuff to show. We've got red blood cells in the blood. Sorry about that yawn. Didn't sleep well last night. High O2 in the alveolus and low O2 in the blood. So the oxygen diffuses into the blood, but we don't carry much oxygen dissolved in the blood itself. Instead, inside the red blood cells, we have a whole lot of hemoglobin molecules, and they are a great place for the oxygen to bind. So and once it's bound, it's like the oxygen doesn't count anymore when we think about oxygen concentrations. So here's our hemoglobin molecule. It binds O2, and now it looks to this system as if there is no O2 in the red blood cells. And so the red blood cells are always going to be lowest O2. The plasma will be medium O2, while the alveolar air is what's the highest O2. And so we're going to see the oxygen diffuse from the air into the plasma, and then very quickly diffuse into the cytoplasm of the red blood cell, and from there be bound up to this hemoglobin molecule. And when hemoglobin binds oxygen, it makes a material called oxyhemoglobin. And oxyhemoglobin is the really, really red, bright red pigment that we see in blood when it's been exposed to lots and lots of oxygen. With internal respiration, here the transport of oxygen is all about unloading oxygen out to the peripheral tissues. So again, we'll draw a big fat capillary. Here are the tissue cells that are busy using or needing oxygen in order to make ATP energy. So it's high O2 in the red blood cell with that bound hemoglobin carrying 4 oxygen molecules. So HB has got 4 O2s attached to it. So we have medium to low O2 here in the blood plasma itself, but out in the tissue fluids, especially if the tissues have been working hard metabolically, then this area here is going to be lowest O2. or low, very low O2. So the low O2 interstitial fluid is sapped of its oxygen, bringing it even lower. The medium low O2 of the plasma then gets sapped of its oxygen, and this low O2 environment starts screaming, hey, we need some oxygen. And so that's when hemoglobin rises up to the challenge of releasing the oxygen. And the oxygen then moves out of the red blood cell into the blood plasma, replacing that which made the jump out of the blood plasma into the tissue fluid, which is replacing the oxygen that made the jump into the peripheral tissue cells. So oxyhemoglobin releases oxygen and delivers it, unloads it into the peripheral tissues. So as the pH of blood decreases, and this is measured, we have tools that we can measure this, but as the pH of blood decreases and the blood becomes warmer, which is what happens in active tissues, because remember, active tissues are producing CO2, and CO2 plus water yields us H2CO3, which is an acid, carbonic acid, and it drops off a hydrogen, and then there we are. So with the pH changing and the temperature changing, it turns out those two conditions, which are common in active tissues, cause hemoglobin to release oxygen more easily. And so because we're creating conditions of low O2 concentration, because we have here in the cells, because we have low pH and relatively high temperature as we're exercising or doing things, then the process creates the best possible environment for stripping the oxygens off of the oxyhemoglobin molecule. So it's a nice little adaptive feature that the conditions of using tissues and using up oxygen also help to create conditions that help to get the oxygen off of the hemoglobin molecules as the blood's passing through those regions of higher activity. And then we've got a term, hypoxia, hypoxia, low oxygen levels in the tissue is hypoxia. Okay, almost there. Just got to talk a little bit about internal and external respiration with carbon dioxide. So, we don't carry much oxygen in the blood plasma. Most of it's carried as oxyhemoglobin. It's different, though, with CO2. So here and we'll start with internal respiration because that's the source of CO2. So here's the blood vessel, here's a tissue cell, and it's busy making CO2 inside the tissue cell there, thanks to the work of the mitochondria. All right, so this is low CO2 blood that is coming from the heart after having been pumped through the lungs. So it's low CO2, but the cells in the peripheral tissue, as they do their ATP making processes, they will let go of CO2. And so the CO2 from the source dissolves goes right across the cell membranes, dissolves in the tissue fluids, and then because the blood is so low in CO2, then it can move right on into the bloodstream and dissolve there in the blood. So a small amount of CO2, about 7%, is carried in blood plasma. Still lots more than the oxygen, the 2% of oxygen that was carried there. More CO2 is carried here in the red blood cells. Again, hemoglobin is our friend. And for every one of the globin molecules, it can carry a carbon dioxide, It can carry a carbon dioxide with the hemoglobin that's inside the red blood cell. And when that carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin, we call it carbaminohemoglobin. And that carries about 23% of the CO2 that we breathe in while we're, not breathe in, but that we make. So 23% plus 7%, so we've counted for 30% carried between the hemoglobin and just dissolved in the blood plasma. The other 70%, though, goes through this reaction. And I do want you to know this reaction. You need to be able to produce this reaction when I ask you for it, because I will ask you for it. So when you take CO2, mix it with water, then we make the acidic H2CO3, and the carbonic acid, it releases its hydrogen, and we still have a bicarbonate ion running around. Bicarbonate ions, they are built primarily inside the red blood cell. They are they do it with an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. So without carbonic anhydrase, this reaction would go very slowly, and it catalyzes the reaction between CO2 and water with carbohydrate anhydrase. And let's see, I think that's it. So lots and lots of HCO3 minus here and hydrogen ions. All right, so there we are. That's where most of the CO2 is carried here in this bicarbonate ion. And, of course, it makes the blood acidic. All right, last of all, we bring that blood back to the lungs. Here's the alveolus. So the first thing is the CO2 is going to be highly enriched in the blood. And so the first thing that needs to happen is that CO2 that was dissolved in the blood plasma, that 7%, will begin to unload into the into the alveolus. And as the plasma CO2 gets lower, then this carbonic acid reaction runs in reverse. So now we start taking bicarbonate and hydrogen ions, and we use them to build carbonic acid. So the carbonic acid, the H2CO3, then falls apart into water and CO2. So with CO2 coming out of the solution in the plasma, and then CO2 being released from the red blood cell, where that carbonic where another enzyme helps to run that reaction a little bit differently, and so that moves more CO2 out of the red blood cell, and along the way that carbaminohemoglobin will also push out some material. Some of that, come on, it'll push out some of the CO2. So between these three processes, we just undo everything that we did out there in the peripheral tissues. So CO2 comes out of solution, carbonic acid is formed, and then releases CO2 into the plasma, which also comes out of solution, and then carbaminohemoglobin lets go of CO2 and releases it out to the plasma, and then it diffuses into the alveolus.